Alright guys, so I wanted to make a more detailed video about beginner strength training. So why strength train, and as a beginner, what are the considerations? So what are the goals and how best can you design a beginner strength or resistance training program? So to start off with, this could be a video in itself, but I just wanted to go over why you would want to resistance train in the first place. So if your goal is to get stronger and put on more muscle mass, it's pretty obvious. That's something that you need to have in place. I'm not really going to touch on that. From a body composition point of view, so a common goal for most people, lose fat, tone up, however you want to describe it. A lot of people will default to doing more and more cardio and pulling back their calories, like restricting calories quite hard. Instead of this, a resistance training program is a much more optimal way to go about it for a number of reasons. I'll just touch on it quickly. I'd say the biggest one is that you can see drastic improvements in your body with the scale weight remaining the same. So you can be putting on muscle, you can be reducing fat, your body's going to shrink in the right places, going to look toned in the right places without you having to drastically cut your calories. So your scale weight can stay the same. In some cases, you can even go up a little bit and you'll end up looking and feeling better. So if you want a bit more detail on this, I've linked an article down below by Brett Contreras. This would be a very good article to have a read over. And it's just a good source of information in general if you want to have a bit more of a read about strength training. So onto the actual nuts and bolts. The first thing that we need to do is define what actually is a beginner. So most people would think about someone who's new to the gym, who's just come in, just started doing resistance training. That's definitely valid. If you're in your first year of training, that's a pretty good definition. What I like to think about though is if you're still able to come into the gym and make progress every single time, then you're still in the beginner phase. So if you can come in and just add weight session to session, week to week, you're still in the beginner phase in my eyes. So that could be a couple of months, that could be up to a year. It sort of depends on how often you're training and your previous history as well. So when you get to like a more intermediate or advanced stage, in contrast, you need to get a bit more creative with your program. You need to manipulate the volume and the intensity in order to make progress. And you're not going to be seeing progress every session. It's going to be more of a month-to-month thing or block to block. Whereas as a beginner, you can come in every week and just simply add weight to the bar. Not a lot of weight, but you can always add weight. Once you get out of that stage, I would say you're now intermediate. So with that said, as a beginner, what are the main goals of your program? The first and most important goal is building technical proficiency. So I think this one speaks for itself, but there's going to be a lot of new movements your body's not quite accustomed to yet. Obviously, you want the weights to start light. You want to start quite basic. Your goal is to ingrain that muscle memory of proper technique. And I mean, there's a few reasons for this. One, it's from an injury prevention point of view. Certain exercises, you want to learn how to brace, how to keep like a neutral spine. You just want to have clean technique to keep yourself, reduce the risk of injury essentially, but also from a point of view of hitting certain muscles. When you get proficient with your technique, you'll find that you can do things like a wrong way and a right way. A lot of the times you can execute a lift, but the technique isn't optimal and you might not work what you're trying to work. You might not feel what you're trying to feel. I know that's a little bit vague, but the general goal as a beginner is first and foremost trying to ingrain optimal technique, because that'll set you up for the intermediate and advanced stages when you're trying to really push the weight. Before you start adding significant amount of weight, you want to make sure that your technique is clean, everything feels good, and you're comfortable with the exercises. The next goal is actually extending the beginner phase as long as you want. Like, people differ on this, but I think you want to stay a beginner as long as possible, using that definition that I just gave you before. Like, think about it. Like, if you can come in workout to workout, week to week, and add weight every single time, you want to keep that going as long as possible before you need to start fighting for each kilogram, each little increase in strength. So to lead on from that, you want to think about giving yourself the minimum effective dose. That just essentially means doing as little as you can to keep yourself getting better. I'll go and talk on this in a bit more detail, but to summarize it, you're still new to training. Even simple exercises, light weights, not a lot of volume, it's going to get you better. keep it on the more conservative side of things. One, so your technique doesn't break down, but two, so that you can keep progressing longer before you start to plateau. So moving on, now we'll move into the exercises that you want to focus on. So again, quite a big subject. To break it down, you really want to focus on compound multi-joint lifts as opposed to isolation exercises like single joint lifts. So to give you a classic example, compound multi-joint lift would be like a squat pattern, and isolation, like single joint exercise, would just be like a seated leg extension or a seated hamstring curl. So why do you want to focus on compound lifts? The reason for that is that basic exercises build basic mass. So as a beginner, you don't really have any weak points yet. Like everything is weak. You're just trying to generally build strength, generally build muscle all over your body. So you want to implement compound exercises because you're using the most amount of muscle mass in the one exercise. You're able to handle more weight and you're going to get more growth out of that one exercise compared to isolation exercises, where you're going to have to do an endless amount of them to get the same benefit. When you start getting more and more advanced, and you start realizing that you have certain weak points, that's when isolation exercises can come into it a little bit more. But as a beginner, the focus is on nailing the technique on big compound lifts. So your squats, your deadlift patterns, like bench, overhead press, pull-ups, rows, all that kind of stuff, you're going to get the biggest benefit out of it in the least amount of time as well. It's a big point. You can hit like the total body in under an hour easily. So moving on, how do you actually structure a session? So there's a lot of different beginner strength training programs out there, and you can have a look at all the different ones. I'll link some down below, but what you want to think about is, rather than muscles, you want to think about movements. So I'll just quickly summarize them and then go into a bit more depth about them. So you want to hit all these movements to ensure that your program is balanced and you're not prioritizing one area of your body over another. So from top to bottom, let's keep it surface level to start with. So you've got lower body push, lower body pull. So lower body push is any type of squat movement. So barbell squat, kettlebell goblet squat, dumbbell squat, front squat. There's a lot of different things that you can do. Lower body pull is any type of deadlift or hip hinge type movement. So again, it can be dumbbells or kettlebells, like RDL or Romanian deadlift, barbell deadlift, obviously. Anything where you're kind of hinging through the hips. So you might not be able to visualize it right now, but it's that deadlift kind of pattern where you're working more of your posterior chain. So your glutes, your hamstrings, your lower back, as opposed to lower body pull, which is more quad dominant. Essentially, you're hitting the quads a little bit harder, like in a squat pattern. So that's the lower body. Onto the upper body, it's the same thing. Upper body push, upper body pull. This one's a little bit simpler to understand. Upper body push, you're pushing something away from you. Think of a push-up. Upper body pull, you're pulling something towards you. So think about a row or a chin-up. To go into a little bit more depth, you can divide that into horizontal and vertical. So horizontal to start with would be bench press or push-ups and row type movements. Vertical would be like overhead press, military press, and chin-up movements. So vertical push, military press, vertical pull, pull-ups. Horizontal push, bench press, horizontal pull, rows. So that is the main foundation. There's two more little categories that you can toss in alongside that, and that's core. So I think that's pretty simple. Anything where you're really working in midsection. There's different definitions of core. For now, just think of it rib cage down to hips, all the trunk muscles. And the last one is unilateral exercises. So anything where you're working one joint at a time. So think about a lunge or like a split squat. You're only using one leg at a time. It's kind of like, it's a cherry on top, but it is a good idea to toss something like this in just for overall kind of stability, making sure you're not causing any imbalances. So like you don't have one side that's stronger than the other. So over the course of the week, you want to have all of this in your program, at least the first four. So upper body push, upper body pull, and you generally want to be balanced between all of them. So I know this it's a little bit kind of complicated to understand at first initially. That's where it'll help to have a look at some programs. But to give you a real simple example, maybe you train 2 days a week. It could be a squat movement, a deadlift movement, some kind of bench, some kind of row, and then the second day of the week, it could be some kind of squat movement, some kind of deadlift movement, some kind of vertical push, some kind of upper body, like overhead press, and then some kind of chin-up movement. And then optional would be throwing in abs and throwing in some one-legged type work. So moving into a bit more depth as well. Within each category of those exercises, there's more technical movements and there's less technical movements. So progressions, the harder ones, regressions, the easier ones. So you want to start at first, like what I was talking about before, you want to build technical proficiency. So to do that, you want to start with the simpler movements, make sure they're mastered, and then move on to the more difficult ones. So let's see. Let's use the squat as an example. So easiest version, and this is what I'll start most people off with, is a goblet squat. So it can be kettlebell or dumbbell on the chest, holding it like that. This is an easier movement because the weight out in front of you counterbalances you. It makes it easier to stay upright. It makes it easier to get down low. Whereas when you try and get to a barbell squat, A, the weight is usually heavier, but B, it's harder to get down low without tipping forward like that. So you would start with an easier progression, master it, and then move on to a more difficult progression. Deadlift is another one. So I've made videos on this, but essentially you want to start off with just the hip hinge to start with, then the RDL, make sure you're good at that. So that's the top part of the deadlift. And then when you feel comfortable with that, then you move on to the full deadlift from the floor. So it's just making sure that you're building the technical proficiency. So if you go to start deadlifting, bang, straight off the bat, I can almost guarantee you it's not going to look good. If you lead your way into it and use simpler exercises to start with, it's going to look a lot better. On that side of things as well, try and start off with dumbbells and kettlebells before you move on to the bar. I mean, on the dumbbells, it's good just to have each arm or each leg working independently. So dumbbell bench, rather than using the barbell and pushing both arms at once, you've got a dumbbell in each hand. So it's like I was talking about, you're using both arms individually, so you're not going to build up one stronger than the other, whereas barbell, you can kind of favor one over the other. So I hope that makes sense, but it's essentially just starting off with simpler versions of the exercise. And it's a big subject because every exercise really has a progression and a regression. You can scale it up to make it harder, you can scale it down to make it easier, and that's where I think for a beginner, that's part of the art of coaching and programming. So moving to a bit more of the macro side of things now, how does the plan look across the week? How many days, and then how are you progressing it? So days a week, what you want to think about, I've touched on this before, but minimum effective dose. Minimum effective dose. So as a beginner, if you're just starting off strength training, everything you do is going to get you better, and you want to do the minimum that you want to do as close as you can to that minimum effective dose, so that you can keep progressing long before you start to plateau. So, I mean, that's kind of vague. So let's give you a more specific example. So in each session, you're trying to think about doing total on each exercise, anywhere from 15 to 30 total reps. So the rep range I would start with for beginners is anywhere from 5 to 12. It doesn't matter that much. You just don't want to do too much volume to where you're breaking down your technique, because again, you can do a little bit of volume, a little bit of weight, and you'll still get a lot of benefit out of it. And it's better to start on the smaller side of things rather than just chucking the weight on and chucking the volume on straight away and sacrificing the technique. So there's that to talk about. That's part of it. And then how many days a week do you train is probably the other important one. So I would say when you're still in the beginner phase, 2 to 3. Start with 2 and then go to 3 if you feel good. This comes into minimum effective dose, and it also comes into muscle protein synthesis. So as a beginner compared to advanced, after you train, you break down the muscle, you start what's called the MTOR pathway, and then what will happen is your muscle protein synthesis will elevate For a beginner, that'll last for 2 days. For an advanced trainer, that's more like a day. So what does that mean? It essentially means as a beginner, you need to give yourself 2 days to actually allow the muscles to rest, recover, and grow. And you're just going to get the most benefit out of that. Like, there's no point jumping in and just going like, bang, like 5 sessions a week straight off the bat. You're not going to recover. You're going to really stall your progress a lot quicker. Whereas when you're advanced, you need to give yourself a bit more volume, which means you need to train more frequently. You need to train like 4 or 5 days a week. So as a beginner, 2 to 3 days a week, covering those basic exercises, anywhere from like 4 to 6 exercises in a session, I would say. You shouldn't be in there for longer than an hour. You're focusing on, again, the technical proficiency, keeping the weight light, and just trying to do that. It can be really simple to start with. That's another thing to talk about. So let's move into like periodization now. So that's essentially just how you progress training. So first off is the exercise selection. As a beginner, you can really just keep the exercises essentially the same. As an advanced trainer, you'll start to kind of accommodate and your body will get used to exercises. You've got to switch it up a little bit more. But as a beginner, you're still like greasing the groove. You're still getting used to the technique of the exercises. And since you're starting from down here, you can just keep adding weight with the same exercise. You're not going to stall as quickly as you would if you were advanced. So pick something that feels good, exercises that you can implement with good technique, and then stick with that. And then in terms of what you're doing session to session, week to week, you can employ what's called linear periodization. And that sounds fancy, but all that is, as simple as it sounds, is just adding weight every session. Because as a beginner, you can do that. For lower body exercises, it's going to be simpler because you're using more muscle mass, you've got more strength, you can lift more weight. You can do, for like a squat, for example, you can usually add around like 5 kilos every time. So every session or every week as you get down the road a little bit further. Upper body exercises, you can't use as much weight, so you've got to take smaller jumps. It's really as small as you can. So like 2.5 kilos. If you can even go smaller because again, that'll keep that progress going longer. But that's what linear periodization is. It's just adding weight session to session, keeping the reps and the sets essentially the same. And just going, if there's 2 guiding principles when you're thinking about weight selection, it'd be these 2 things. One is start light, like start criminally light. Start something where you think like, am I even doing anything here? That'll ensure that your technique is solid and it'll give you a lot of room to go up. And then the second principle is progress slow, like slow. Again, like slower than you think you need to. Again, it's all about keeping that progress going long as you can. Like think back, what's the main goal? We're trying to extend this phase long as you can. Because trust me, as a beginner, it's beautiful. It's so simple when you can come in and you can just add weight like every time. You don't need to worry about like macrocycles and adjusting volume, adjusting intensity, and like deloading. It's just, all right, I'm going to come into the gym today. I'm going to be stronger. I'm going to add weight. It's a beautiful thing, and you want to keep that going as long as you can. So I think that essentially covers everything. So that's the beginner phase. When you find that you can't do this anymore, that's when you're intermediate, and that's when you want to sort of start switching things up a little. So have a look. Some example beginner programs. I think Bill Starr probably kicked this all off. So Bill Starr had a 5x5 program. That's a good one to have a read of. His book, The Strongest Shall Survive. That just gives you a kind of idea about the whole training process as well. Along that line of thinking as well, a great book is Starting Strength by Mark Rippetoe. It's a fantastic book. It goes into like the details of the technique on the compound lifts, just kind of like the general philosophy of strength training as well. Goes into linear periodization, a little bit of diet stuff too. The diet stuff gets a bit funky, but it's a great book. More beginner programs like Strong Lifts 5x5. That's a good one to have a look at and read. You can go 2 ways. You can either go for one of those and just try and implement it, or you can vary the exercises a little bit depending on your needs. So to give you the example of like starting strength, it's barbell squat, barbell deadlift. Maybe you're not ready for that initially. You've got to lead into it. You've got to do like a kettlebell goblet squat, a kettlebell RDL before you can jump in. But it's good to read anyway to get the to get the principle, to just understand what the whole kind of process is about. And then you want to keep this phase going as long as you can. Like I said, progress slow as you can. Move the weight up little by little. And then when you get to that point where you can't just increase week to week, session to session, you're an intermediate, and now you want to have a look at other programs. A good one to kind of dip your toe into it would be Jim Wendler's 531 program. That's a really good one for strength. You can adjust it a little bit for hypertrophy as well, but that's the bare bones of it. That's the nuts and bolts. I hope you enjoy the video. Catch you next time.